Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. I am here to share a Emboss Resist card with you today. This is for the Catherine Pooler Love is in the Air Stamp of Approval collection. This collection has gone live. It went live at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for those of you that are on the wait list, and it will be available to the general public at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I need to warn you that these collections generally sell out pretty fast, so there is a possibility that by the time you see this video, it will be sold out. So let's start taking a look at some of the products that are in the collection. This is the Love die, and I just adore this. If you watched my video yesterday, you will have seen that there is another stamp that kind of looks like this, but this gives it a little bit of a twist on it. This is the World Awaits stamp set. This is a big, beautiful stamp set. I just adore this. This is meant to look like a world map, and I just dig it. And I'm really going to play that up today. But I also really enjoy all of the other tiny little elements in there that you can really use to build up a really spectacular background if you wanted to. Now, I'm going to be doing some ink blending, but you could certainly color this in and it would be fab. So let's get started. I have a piece of 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock, and I have it here in my Misty stamping tool because I am going to be doing some heat embossing, and I want to make sure that I have my images stamped on my card panel really well. So that's why I'm using the Misty. You can use a large stamp block for this and it would be just fine, but I know myself well enough to know that the Misty is pretty much always the way to go. Now, as you can see inside the backing sheet of the stamp set, it is laid out exactly how it's meant to look for a world map. So what I'm doing is I'm actually holding that backing sheet over my card panel so I can get them placed just right. Now, it's not going to take up my entire card, and that's fine. I'm actually going to build this up a little bit. And I do have some of these hanging over the top of my panel because I don't want it to go completely across my panel as well. At this point, I'm trying to preserve as much white space as I can, and you'll see what I'm getting at as soon as we start doing the ink blending. So I just have these lined up on my Misty stamping tool and making sure everything is good to go before I close the door. I'm going to close the door on those and pick them up, and I'm going to make sure that my panel isn't shifting. I normally use the Misty Creative corners, but I stashed them someplace, so I'm just relying on my little magnets there to keep my panel in place, and I'm trying real hard to make sure that it isn't going to shift. Now I'm going to use my EK Success powder tool, and I am putting a ton of this on there. It's hard to see in the video, but I pulled out quite a few of the bristles that are inside that. So when I use my powder tool, I get a ton on my paper. I prefer it that way because I don't want to take any chances that I'm going to have any loose powder sticking where I don't want it to. And when you're doing ink blending like this, especially with bold, bright colors, it will be really noticeable if you have any stray powder. So I'm inking up my stamp with Versamark ink because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. I have a tendency to over ink my Versamark pads. I like to make sure that they're nice and sticky. You don't need to do that. I just feel that this always gives me a much better impression when I do that, but you certainly don't. You can continue to stamp this as many times as you need to until you're sure that you have a clear image stamped on your card panel. So now that I have that stamped on there, I'm going to cover this in Wow Clear Embossing Powder. And this is where it gets kind of tricky. I do not want to heat this panel any more than I have to. I do have my heat gun heating up in the background, but I don't want to continue to heat this panel. The more you heat it up, the more likely it is to warp. However, I can't see with just the Versamark ink on there where I need to stamp next. And this round of stamping was a pretty large area, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to rotate it here in my MISTI without messing that up. So I did heat that first round that time. However, from here on out, I'm going to stamp and put the embossing powder on as much as I possibly can before I heat it up again. And I only do need to do that a couple of times, so that really does help a bunch, and it really does minimize warping. Now, I took a couple of the stamps that I had stamped the first time, and I just kind of rotated them a little bit so they don't look exactly the same as how they were stamped the first time, because I do want to fill this panel up a little bit. I'm still trying to preserve as much white space as I possibly can, because as soon as I start ink blending, I really want to make those inks shine. I want to highlight the stamping I did, but I really want those inks to stand out so you can really get the full effect of the Emboss Resist. And regardless of how much anti-static powder I put on my card panel, I always double check it to make sure I don't have any loosies floating around that are just going to make me feel like I ruined my card panel later. Now I'm taking some of the smaller stamps that are also in the World Awaits stamp set, and I'm just kind of filling things in here and there. I still really want a lot of white space on this card, but I like these smaller details. This is where I really feel like you're getting a lot of use out of a stamp set, is when you can pull in those smaller images and incorporate them into your larger images. I think it just stretches it that much further, and I really, really enjoy that. So I'm stamping them in Versamark ink. I'm adding embossing powders so I can see where they have them, and I'm just kind of eyeballing it. With stamps like these, it's kind of hard to come up with a plan, but they're really easy to make it all work together, and it's really enjoyable, I think. So I just keep doing that until I have everything where I want it. And again, I'm going to avoid heating this up until I absolutely have to. Now, my heat gun is really hot. I actually still have it running in the background while I'm doing this. However, too much heat repeatedly on a card panel, it will warp it. And also, at this point, I hadn't quite decided how I was going to finish this, so that was important to me to make sure that I wasn't going to have a bunch of warping. As it turned out in the end, the way I ended up finishing the card, it probably wouldn't have mattered, but I was definitely keeping this in mind as I was making it. So I just finished filling those in where I wanted them, and then when I was done, I made sure that I heat set it really well so I wouldn't end up smearing any of that when I started doing the ink blending, which I'm actually going to start doing now. So I thought a rainbow would be awesome for this, and I'm kind of feeling the whole purple to blue rainbow instead of pink to purple rainbow, if that makes any sense. So I decided to start with the Catherine Pooler Pixie Dust ink, and I really love this purple. It is such a fantastic purple. I'm starting fairly light to begin with because I'm totally going to build this up by the time I'm done. Now I flip my panel over and I'm working with the Fiesta Blue. I have to fit 8 ink colors into this. Well, I didn't have to, but I wanted to fit 8 ink colors into this. What you could do is you could do like pink and orange and blend those, and you would have your red and so on and so forth. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to use all of them. So I'm flipping my panel back and forth so I can make sure that I have enough room to get them all on there. Okay, so that was Party Dress. Now I'm blending on Aquatini. I really love this blue-green. It is a gorgeous blue-green. So my ink pad is just a little bit dry, so I have to work a little bit harder to get it on there, but that's okay. We're going to build, like I said, we're going to build this up quite a bit. Now I'm adding the Rockin Red. Now this is where it can get kind of tricky. So the mini blending foams that I'm using, they're fairly wide. So you kind of have to think about it before you apply it. You are going to go over the color next to it. There's no way around it. When you're trying to fit this many inks on a card, you're definitely gonna go over some of the color you went over before. I was a little nervous that I was gonna lose some of that Party Dress ink with that Rockin Red, but it actually ended up turning out in the end, so no big deal. Okay, that was Orange Twist. Before that was Lime Ricky. Now I'm using Tiki Torch, and this is really brilliant yellow, folks. If you are looking for a really fantastic ink pad, Tiki Torch is the way to go. So I added that on there, and now I can start building up the intensity of those colors. And you may have also noticed that I was making sure that I did not take my ink blending all the way to the other side of the panel. The first time I did that on purpose. I was giving myself enough space to build it out as I went because I didn't want the whole panel covered. I wanted it to kind of fade to a lighter version of itself. As it is, I ended up trimming this panel down so you kind of can't notice that it faded to a white, but I still had the effect that it faded to a lighter version of itself, and that was perfect. Either way, it still would have looked great whether I trimmed it down or not. Now again, I'm coming in with that Rockin Red, and you can see how much more bold and vibrant these colors get. I think they're just beautiful. Catherine Pooler inks are some of my favorite inks to blend with because of this. They're just gorgeous. Also, something to note about Catherine Pooler inks. For me personally, I over ink them. I over ink every ink pad that I own. However, especially with Catherine Pooler inks, I like them extra inky because I love how they ink blend. Now, to keep something in mind with that though, if you over ink your Catherine Pooler ink pads, and then you go to stamp with them, you're going to have to keep that in mind. So they work a little bit differently because they are a foam pad instead of a felt pad. So you just kind of give them a little bit of a tap. They call it a love tap with her ink pads, but you have to keep that in mind that much more if you over ink them like I do. But it turns out so much better for ink blending, I think. All right, so I pretty much have this finished up. We're going to call it good with that. Now, I am going to take one of my microfiber cloths and I am going to wipe off the top of this really good because we've pretty much colored our embossing powder. That's fine. It's not going to stick. It is actually resisting that ink, which is why it's called ink resist. But I want to make sure that all of that ink on the surface of my embossing is wiped off so it doesn't smear. And also, I want to bring that white back to it so you can really see those images pop out. Isn't that just gorgeous? I just love this. Rainbows and white embossing or rainbows and black embossing are some of my favorite things ever. Okay, so I have cut the love die from some more Neenah Solar White cardstock, and I'm going to modify this a little bit. For starters, I want to cut that little curly Q off the end of this. Now, I love it the way it is. I think the hand lettering on this is just outstanding. However, when I place it on my card panel, I feel like that little curly Q just kind of competed a little too much with the illustration or of how that world map was illustrated. It's because there's so much going on in it. I personally didn't like it. It was probably just fine, but I thought, why not give it a little bit of a twist and cut that tail off and see how that goes? I like this so much better. So now that I was happy with that, what I'm going to do is make my own colored cardstock. I wanted this to be in black. So I'm taking the Catherine Pooler Midnight Ink ink pad, and I'm going to color this. I'm going direct to paper. I could stop here. However, what actually ends up working better is if you turn that die cut over and you do it from the back side as well. What ends up happening is it ends up getting in all of those nooks and crannies, perfect around the edges. So by the time it's done, it legit looks like a piece of black cardstock. It's really handy. So now it's time to add a little bit of detail to my sci-fold card base. This is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. It's just a standard A2 size card base. And I'm lining up my panel, my emboss resist panel, along the edge of the fold of my card base because I need to know exactly where I need to stamp this border stamp. This is also in the World Awaits stamp set. There's actually 2 styles of border stamps in it, and I thought thought that this one was just perfect with this card panel. So I apologize that you can't see what's going on there, but I had to pull it close to me and make sure that I had the stamp lined up straight. Now you could take a ruler and place it in there, line it up against your stamp, close the lid, and everything would be okie dokie. However, my ruler was across the room and I wasn't getting up to get it. So that's that. So after I had that in place, I did find my Misty Creative Corner in the process. I placed all that, made sure that that was secure in my Misty stamping tool, and took out that card panel. And now I'm going to ink up this border stamp with the Catherine Pooler Midnight ink, and I'm going to stamp it on there. I believe I only show you where I did this once, but I actually ended up doing this a couple times. The Midnight ink, the Midnight Black ink, is actually really crisp, a dark ink out the gate, but I was really going to go for the gold and make sure that it was nice and solid, nice and black. So it really worked well with that love sentiment that I'm placing on there. Now I have a sentiment from the Bon Voyage stamp set. I did not show you that. I'm keeping it a surprise for those of you that are getting your stamp of approval box. But I just want the word you, because I just want my panel to say love you. So you could cut this apart. However, that always freaks me out. So I'm just masking off the word miss, and then I'm going to ink up the word you. Now don't forget when you do this, folks, to pull off your tape, whatever you've used to cover up that other side, because if you don't, you will have a mess and it will be very sad. So I also stamped that a couple times to make sure everything was nice and black, black and crisp. And I actually, at this point, I have mounted my panel onto my card base, but I put a piece of fun foam behind it. So it was popped up and I had some dimension to go with it. I lost the footage on it, folks. I'm so sorry. But it's actually really easy to do. So now I'm getting ready to attach my sentiment to this. I am just going to leave this a matte black. You could add some shimmer to this. You could heat emboss this with a clear embossing powder. You could have heat embossed it with a black embossing powder. But I already have quite a bit of shine going on from the embossing that I had done. So I really don't want this sentiment to compete with this. I'm using the Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this to my card base because it does give me a little bit of wiggle room. This die cut, it actually, there's only so many different ways you can place it before the V and the E kind of start to separate a little bit. It will tear if you're not careful, but it does give you a little bit. And I kind of played that up just a tad bit so the die cut wasn't straight on my panel. Now, at this point, if you wanted to add some embellishments, you totally could. You could use some clear sequins. You could use some clear droplets. There's actually quite a few different things you could use. I did not want to add any more dimension to the front of this card. I felt that this was just fine. However, I am using my Sakura Stardust glitter pen to fill in those little hearts that I had heat embossed on the front of it. And then I'm going to take my Spectrum Noir clear overlay pen and all of those images that look like water splashes, like the one I was just coloring in, I'm just filling those in. I do that across the whole panel. It's just a very light layer. I usually go for the gold when I'm using the Spectrum Noir pen. This time it was just a light layer and I called it good. Okay, so I finished coloring in all of those with the glitter pen and I'm going to call it a day. I really don't feel like this card needs anything else. I think it is just fine on its own. You can see where at the bottom of that heat or emboss resist panel where it does get lighter, where I didn't do all of that heavy ink blending. I think that it looks a little bit lighter altogether in the video, but in real life, folks, these colors just pop. And I really, really enjoy how this turned out. So that's it. We are done. We are good to go. I have links down below in the description as well as over on my blog, so do be sure to check those out. I hope you enjoyed my card today. If you did, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Also, be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and tap that bell next to the subscribe button so you can receive all future notifications. Thanks again so much for stopping by. Until next time.